Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session today titled Comparing the Discretionary, Delegated, and Directed Trustee's Role and the Trust Protector. My name is John Barkhurst, and I will be the moderator for today's session. We're pleased to have Kevin Moss from Pohl Consulting and Training join as our presenter today, and I will be introducing Kevin in just a few minutes. On behalf of my colleagues, Leon Wessels, Joe Gosted, and Aaron Hansen from ITM 21st and Life Insurance Trust Company, as well as our strategic partners, Judy Pearson from Nomadic Solutions and Michael Brohan from Your Life Insurance Solution. We want to thank you for attending today's session. Today marks the fifth webinar since the restart of ITM 21st University's online education opportunities. If you find that the time was well spent and the information helpful, please share with your friends and colleagues. And certainly, if you're not already signed up for the ITM 21st blog, you can do so at our website. It's a great resource delivering commentary on timely and relevant wealth management topics directly to your inbox. A little housekeeping here. We are using the GoToWebinar platform for these sessions. Each will be recorded and available on the ITM 21st website on the recent webinars page under the Educations tab. The phone lines are muted for all attendees, but if you do have a question, please ask those questions via the questions chat box in the GoToWebinar panel. I'll be monitoring those personally, and we'll allocate some time at the end of the session to answer any questions that you might have. If it's a question that you don't want addressed openly here in the forum today, please indicate so, and we'll respond with a follow-up email. You see there, continuing education credits. All of our sessions are free of charge, even for those seeking CE credits. All of the webinars that we put on are submitted for 1 hour of CTFA and CFP continuing ed. For those of you who are also members of the Fiduciary and Investment Risk Management Association, better known as FIRMA, you may also receive member credits for today's session. To receive your CE credits, you can download the form from the GoToWebinar panel under the Handouts section. If for some reason you can't locate it or you're having difficulty downloading it, you can also pull that form down from the ITM 21st website under the Education tab. Please complete that form and return it to us with the required information. You can email it to itm21u@itm21st.com within 7 business days, please. If you have any questions about CE credits or issues, please send an email to that same address and we'll be sure to respond. We're grateful to the ABA and the CFP for recognizing our sessions and allowing us to provide you with continuing education credit opportunities. The ITM 21st University faculty is a distinguished group of industry experts. Leon Wessels from Life Insurance Trust Company, Aaron Hansen from ITM 21st, Michael Brohan, Your Life Insurance Solutions, and Judy Pearson from Nomadic Solutions. For those of you who attended the last webinar, Aaron and Michael provided a very informative session on life settlement transactions of trust-owned life insurance policies. And for those who attended last month to Judy's session, it was a great presentation on minimizing trustee liability. We're pleased to welcome various guest speakers from time to time as well. Today's session is a great example of that, with Kevin joining us from Pohl Consulting and Training, and he has a very timely and relevant topic to discuss on directed and delegated trust. And then next month, we welcome Rachel Green and Cheryl Severson from Team Risk Management Strategies to speak on the topic of paying caregivers and employees from a trust. You see there that session is scheduled for July 22nd. You won't want to miss it, especially if you are dealing with trust clients who have caregivers, nannies, housekeepers, or other in-home workers. Rachel and Cheryl will discuss considerations to the trust from a fiduciary perspective of being an employing entity, common missteps and potential liabilities that trustees face when they have employees, HR and compliance regulations for employers, and how to properly classify workers as 1099 contractors or W-2 employees, and the repercussions of each classification. So for those that have attended our first few webinars, Leon's done a great job of delivering the winning minute by Mac Hammond. And so today's insight talks about controlling the future. Humans have an insatiable need to know the future. However, this desire for knowledge can never really be fully satisfied. For as soon as tomorrow becomes today, another tomorrow is waiting right around the corner. And that's why worrying about the future will always be constant, unless you predetermine beforehand what your future will look like. Of course, we're not saying you can control circumstances, because you cannot, but you can predetermine that you will face the future with confidence. Decide today that when tomorrow comes, you'll work within the values and guidelines you've set for your life, because that is the only part of the future you can control. It's an honor and privilege to introduce today's speaker, Kevin Moss. Kevin is the president of Wealth Management Compliance Alliance, a division of Poll Consulting and Training. Poll Consulting and Training provides a wide range of regulatory and compliance services involving wealth management to banks, registered investment advisors, and broker-dealers. Kevin is a 25-year veteran of applying legal, regulatory, and compliance realities to create competitive advantages for banks, RIAs, and broker-dealers. As General Counsel, Chief Compliance Officer, and Business Unit Leader for PrimeVest Financial Services, which is now Cetera Investment Services, and later as President and CEO of ING National Trust, Kevin has been successful in guiding highly regulated organizations through aggressive growth, and doing so in a manner that enhances the firm's business and compliance effectiveness. Kevin has a wealth of knowledge and experience, and his expertise today in this subject matter is really unparalleled. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the introduction, and I want to welcome all of the attendees to today's call. I think that what you're going to find as we go through the next roughly 50 minutes together, hoping to leave actually 40 some minutes, leaving some time hopefully at the end for questions. And please, if you, as questions come up, jot them down so that you can raise them and we can address them. But as we go through the webinar today, there's a couple of things that I want you to be open to or be aware of, and that is, while this topic has, this is not a new topic, but we have new things. In other words, the Uniform Directed Trustee Act, Uniform Directed Trust Act from the Uniform Law Commissioners. That's a fairly new development. It was released in 2017. And as we all know, new things in the trust world are somewhat rare. So we have something new to talk about in an area where many of us are, or many of you, I should say, are already very comfortable. One of the other things I want you to be in tune to or focused on as we go through the webinar is the idea that I'm going to encourage you to look at this topic just a little differently. It shouldn't really change how you do anything, but I think that we are going to describe delegated and directed in a little different fashion than what may be a more typical approach, and we'll kind of let that unfold as we go. So what do we want to do today? What are our goals? We want to talk about what is delegation. Most of you are very familiar with that. We're going to talk about the types of delegation. We're going to talk about what is direction. And this gives us the entree into the Uniform Directed Trust Act, which brings in the idea of trust protectors. And that will be a big part of our conversation today. For your practical application, we want to focus on what is the trustee's role, or excuse me, how is your role affected? And for many of you, this will be very comfortable, very familiar. So we want to reinforce that perspective. For some of you, maybe a little new. Also, we're going to talk about how is the trustee's risk risk or responsibility or fiduciary duty affected by whether a trust is delegated or whether it has powers of direction, etc. We want to also talk about business realities. What are some of the practical issues that you may run into and thoughts on how to deal with those? And then finally, we'll talk about the role of trust protector. And by way of spoiler alert, one of the things that we want to have you focus on is there's absolutely nothing new about the idea of a trust protector. It's really just the power of direction. And we've had directed trust statutes in many states for a very long time. So for those of you for whom a trust protector sounds like something new and foreign, it really isn't. It's not a new concept, but it has, I think, gotten a lot more attention in definitely the last 5 and likely the last 10 years. So why do you care? Well, one, this is just going to be a lot of fun. So you want to stay awake for that because, what could be more interesting than a webinar on directed and delegated trusts on a Wednesday afternoon? So that's why you care. But just a couple of comments here as to the realities that you're faced with. You have clients who are learning more about trust. You have clients who have an investment advisor that they want to use to manage their trust assets, even though you're the trustee. How do you deal with that? And my favorite is the bottom of the last of the 4 examples, and that is someone asks you to explain clearly the difference between a directed trust relationship or the power of delegation. Many of us can describe it. The question is, can we do it clearly, and are we comfortable with our description? And the goal of this webinar is to help you describe the attributes and the distinctions clearly and confidently. So, defining the models, if you will. So we know we have discretionary trusts. We know we have some trusts. We talk about delegation. In other trusts, we talk about direction. So those 3 things are 2 very different models, which is the first point where hopefully I endeavored to keep you awake in that, well, wait a minute, it's either 2 or 3. We all know from public school math that 2 and 3 are different. So really what we need to recognize is that discretion is the power of the trustee to make a decision, granted in the governing document, supported by the applicable trust code in your state. And delegation of any activity or power or function is an exercise of discretion that's vested in the trustee. So here is really the first intro into the distinction I want you to make, and that is delegation is not a different thing than the exercise of the trustee's discretionary authority. It's just the application of it. Same thing with direction. Direction is the opposite. It's something you're told to do. In the trust document supported by the trust code in your state, the grantor in that governing document has directed you to to rely on another party for, normally we're talking investment management, and we'll talk about that a little further. So there's really only 2 things going on here. A trust protector is just how that power of direction is described. So the 2 models in this whole conversation, either there's discretionary authority on behalf of the trustee that you can exercise, choose to exercise, or not, and you bear 100% of the responsibility for your choice. whether it's the delegation of investment management, delegating custody to a third party, delegating the responsibility for handling unique assets to a third party. All of those things are discretionary decisions by the trustee, and you're responsible for them. The opposite is true for direction. You're told what to do, and if the governing document and your state's trust code are clear and effective, your liability and responsibility is quite limited. And that's where the fight starts. So we're going to talk about various levels of responsibility and potential liability risk as we go forward. So talking about delegation in a trust. Delegation is a power. It's a discretionary power. Most modern trust documents have the ability to for the trustee to delegate tasks and are clear on the ability of the trustee to delegate things like investment management to hire third parties, et cetera. So it's a not a new concept, certainly, and the ability of the trustee to make those decisions of their own volition, in other words, on a discretionary basis, is broad and widely accepted. In the area of, just to throw in an example here of how the organization uses its discretionary authority to make decisions. So investment management, which is a common example that we'll use throughout the webinar, but also it isn't the only example of delegation. But so delegation, you're going to delegate investment management. Another way is another way to say that is you're going to decide how to, as the trustee, to manage the funds of the trust. Well, you can use your internal staff. That's a choice. You've decided to do it that way. You've decided to hire people that work for you, and you've delegated the responsibilities to yourself. We really don't talk about it that way, but for purposes of this example, we've delegated to our internal staff, to the folks down the hall. Third way, quite common for many of you, is a third-party registered investment advisor that's in the business of advising trustees. And you know who these firms are. There are a number of them, and they're dedicated to providing investment management to trust accounts at the request of the trustee. So they've been delegated investment authority by you, the trustee. A slight variation on that, which I consider and I generally treat as a different animal, and that is the what I'll call a local delegation of investment authority. In other words, we're not dealing with one of these large firms that cater to our industry. We're dealing with someone in our community. We're dealing with someone who maybe the grantor said, boy, I really like my current investment advisor. Would you please have them manage the money? Again, not a direction in the trust document, but for whatever reason, we're deciding to delegate the investment management authority to a local investment advisor representative, someone we know. One of the things to remember here, and this is perfectly fine, and we'll talk about the details here in a bit, but remember, individual investment advisor representatives can only offer advice through an RIA. They can't exist independently of the RIA. So your relationship must, at least on paper, your contract, your control mechanisms, and your vendor management must flow through the RIA. No exceptions, because otherwise you're not actually dealing with the entity that has ultimate responsibility. So here's a screen full of lots and lots of words. Hopefully they're all spelled right. This is the Uniform Prudent Investor Act, which has been, at least the section of the UPIA that specifically addresses the delegation of investment and management functions by a trustee to someone else. We're going to go through each one of these sections fairly quickly, but individually to make a point about liability and oversight. So the first and the next several slides are subsets of the big block of text we just looked at. So the first point to make is that the UPIA says that a trustee may delegate functions. Functions are tasks, they're work, and they don't include liability and responsibility. So you can delegate the work, but you can't delegate your ultimate responsibility, which is why you need to take care in selecting the firm to whom you've delegated the function. So you have not only a UPIA, Uniform Prudent Investor Act, duty to properly delegate, and that runs parallel and overlaps with your basic vendor management. In this context, the investment firm, and we'll use investments as the example, that's the most common, but the investment firm works for you. You are responsible for them. And so you have that duty. So in looking at going further into that block of text that makes up the Uniform Prudent Investor Act section, we talk about selecting an agent. And so if you select the agent with care, you take the responsibility seriously, and you review them initially, select a good firm, that's the first step in limiting your liability. We're going to find the liability and responsibility doesn't go away entirely, but nonetheless, we can control some of it. Toward the bottom, we talk about obviously the way in which you establish any process, for example, selecting a third party to delegate any function, including investment management process, policies, procedures, and following them, maintaining records, which dovetails again very tightly with vendor management. A point, really a clerical observation as we go forward. As you'll notice as we go through this, the slides contain a lot of words. What I've done here is instead of creating a separate document that supports this webinar, I've essentially put in the core content into these slides, which violates, of course, one of the rules of presentations, which is keep your slides simple. So to the extent you have, and I would appreciate these comments and your comments after the session, I would be very interested to see if you think it's a good idea to include more of the content on the slides so you have one document to deal with, or would you prefer that the PowerPoint slides are more cursory and that the meat and potatoes are in a separate document? Being a poorly reformed farm boy, I regularly refer to meat and potatoes. So this A1 here, this is the first section that helps of the UPIA that helps us take action to control our liability risk when we delegate. The second step is to establish the scope and terms of the delegation consistent with the purpose and terms of the trust. In other words, we need to articulate exactly how the relationship is going to work. And normally this is done via a contract with the party to whom we're delegating responsibility, and also maintaining clear communication as we go through. Always remember that if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. So that's why a formal contract is step one, and then written communication as needed is the path to show that you have established the scope and terms of the delegation. So that if the party steps out, the third party steps outside the lines. You have documentation on the guidance you provided, and then you can most effectively take steps to bring them back within the parameters of the arrangement. Just like in vendor management, the last section talked about the initial setup. This one talks about your ongoing responsibility to review the actions of the person to whom you have chosen to delegate the function, but not the risk or responsibility. That remains with you. When we look at investment management, I think most organizations are well beyond the idea of believing that delegation of investment management to a third party allows you to rely on them and not to have a ongoing obligation to monitor the investment decisions, the holdings, the adherence to the customer's investment policy statement. All of those things really still are your responsibility. You may have delegated the work, but you still have the responsibility. So probably the best example is, of course, in investment and management. It's the belief of myself and many other commentators on the compliance and risk management aspects of delegation. You should still be reviewing the activity, the investment activity in those accounts, with the same frequency and diligence as you would have if you delegated or chose to have people within your building managing the assets of your trust accounts. Certainly, if you had a team of investment folks down the hall that were your coworkers, you would be probably on a daily basis monitoring activity, and some functions you might not monitor daily, but you would be on them regularly. The same should be your standard when you have chosen to exercise your discretionary authority to delegate investment management to a third party. Frequent monitoring, ongoing, regular, is still your responsibility. Now this Uniform Prudent Investor Act section flips its focus to the agent to whom you have delegated the task, and the UPIA says that agent owes a duty to the trust, which is the beginning of the trap that exists here. In other words, in the idea that, well, if they owe a duty to the trust, that's their responsibility, not ours. And unfortunately, you really can't effectively read this section of the UPIA to let the trustee off the hook for fulfilling the duties that are owed to the trust itself. The duty to the trust, the advisor has this duty to exercise reasonable care, but remember, I shouldn't say remember because we haven't said it yet. Time travel is still somewhat problematic. But the last phrase of this section B says, the advisor owes a duty to the trust to exercise reasonable care to comply with the terms of the delegation, not the terms of the governing document. So their duty is only as strong and as clear, and the four corners of that delegation are defined by your contract with the agent you've hired to manage the assets. So there really is no liability protection here for the trustee. It sort of sounds that way, but it's not. Also remember, and this will become more clear or more of an issue when there's a power of direction, but in a delegated situation, the firm that you've delegated, again using investment management as an example, if you've delegated investment management authority to the to a registered investment advisor. They and their staff are meeting regularly with the client, which is really just good customer service. You like that. However, they work for you. And so in a trust, what I call the enforcer of the delegation isn't the client or the beneficiary. So in other words, if a third party investment advisor wants to do something that you're not comfortable with, for the client or the beneficiaries to get in the middle of that conversation and say, well, no, we think it's okay if the third party takes this very aggressive investment with our trust assets. Well, that's good information, but it's your responsibility. You are the enforcer because you're the only one with frontline liability for the performance of the duties and obligations and responsibilities that exist under the trust. This is where we make a distinction between practical reality and your liability, risk, responsibilities, legal requirements of a trustee. The practical realities may argue in favor of being more cooperative with the client and the beneficiary because they're good buddies with the investment manager, so it's all a love fest. Well, that's nice, and maybe you're going to give the investment advisor a little more leeway in that context, but be careful, because if it blows up, it's your problem. That's why you, the trustee, have to be the only enforcer of the contractual delegation. So our final section that we're looking at within this UPIA section is further builds the trap that it's easy to fall into. In other words, the language here says the trustee is not liable to the beneficiaries or to the trust for decisions or action of the advisor to whom the function was delegated. Well, we're off the hook. We're not liable. Well, there's a problem here. You know, it would seem like we're off the hook, but again, words have meaning. Not liable to the beneficiaries for the actions or decisions of the advisor to whom the function was delegated. Okay, cool. They decided to buy IBM. IBM went down. You say, well, we're not responsible for that. But going back to the other sections we've looked at, you are responsible for the very delegation. And so we all know how this will shake out. You're the one with the deep pocket. You're the one who exercised discretion and chose this advisor or this agent. Therefore, you're responsible for their activity. And so this subsection C sounds like a nice liability shield, but it's not. In practice, we've all run into situations or heard of situations, I should say, where despite reliance on this section, beneficiaries have come back to the trustee and held them ultimately responsible, and that's entirely consistent with this language. So now what do we do? Let's get real. So we're trying to run a business. Always be very clear on who has the primary customer relationship. In other words, who has that primary duty to the grantor, to the trust, to the beneficiaries. You need, as we said, you need to maintain your role as the trustee as the primary enforcer. The agent you hire works for you. Their relationship with the beneficiaries is secondary, and they need to be loyal to you first. If they can't do that, then you need to find someone else. Frequently, again, a very practical consideration, and the individual investment advisor or representative who works for the RIA may develop a very wonderful relationship with the clients. Well, that's a very good thing. But what happens if they leave? It's not uncommon for investment advisor representatives to believe that they own customer relationships. In fact, that's the term in the investment world that gets used. They're my customer. I own the relationship. They can't. They're merely hired by you, either they or the RIA. Ultimately, it's the RIA that's retained. And I belabor this point to point out in your contractual arrangement with the third party, the RIA, you need to be crystal clear on the idea that the RIA to whom you have delegated a task does not have control of the customer relationship. And if their employee or their independent contractor, the IAR, leaves, the relationship, the responsibility still rests entirely with you. One of the other practical realities, custody of assets. In delegating, in particular investment management authority, questions arise as to custody. Can that RIA work within a custodial framework that is suitable and acceptable to you? That should be a part of your contractual arrangement. Another important thing is that when you deal with a third party, you need to make sure that the RIA, the investment advisor representative, and the custodian understand that their ability to withdraw funds, their ability to transfer assets doesn't exist, or it's very tightly controlled. You, as the trustee, needs to control the ability to move funds or disperse funds. One of the things that we see is in delegation, obviously there's another mouth that needs to be fed. The RIA needs to be paid, and so this obviously affects, excuse me, I would back a slide, that affects the economics. One of the arguments, a cost argument in favor of professional investment management, is that you're converting a fixed cost staff to a variable cost. Most third-party firms, it's a basis point charge, and so you're reducing fixed costs in favor of variable costs. A factor for your consideration. And unfortunately, 2020 has been quite the interesting year, but it has been a powerful example of the value of professional investment management. Many of us I'll use my own example. I like to manage my own assets. However, a couple of years ago, I realized I'm getting too close to retirement for my normal high-risk strategy. I'm a risk taker. We can argue whether it's good or bad. I just can't change it. So it was the wise thing to do was to put, as I get closer to retirement, put my assets in the hands of a professional. When I look at my portfolio, I go, wow. Given the gyrations of this year, particularly a couple of months ago when everything was falling apart, I'm pretty sure I'd have made a mess of it. Professional money managers have really earned their keep in the last 6 months. And in dealing with organizations like yours that rely on third-party managers, I've seen the same thing across their portfolios. So that's a business consideration. Don't forget vendor management. We've already stressed that. Also, if you're, make sure that your policies and procedures adequately address how you go about delegating any activity. We've talked a lot about investment management, but really you delegate all sorts of tasks, and it's more than just vendor management. And so I encourage you to look at your policies and procedures and confirm that you're in fact have really a written roadmap that shows your deliberate approach to delegation. So this is a wrap up on delegation. So that delegation contract, I suspect there's no one on this call that would consider delegating an activity to a third party without a written contract. Good. Make sure your contract addresses the things that expose you to risk, and really be deliberate about what's in that contract. well thought out policies and procedures. We mentioned that and their value. Internal consistency, which is an education and training idea, and helping everyone in your staff understand that delegation is just what we've been talking about. We're delegating a function, not responsibility. We're still responsible. Making sure your staff understands that, and realizing that words have meaning. Again, I said that before. For those of us who, well, I'm hoping everyone at some point has been exposed to the George Orwell's book, 1984. Words have meaning, and if we use the right words, I think his concept was language controls thought. If we use the right words, in other words, this trust allows us to delegate a function under our discretionary authority. Trusts aren't delegated. They have a power of delegation that we can exercise. So picking your words intentionally as part of your education and internal training is a wise thing. We've talked a bit about the custodian, and then, of course, withdrawals and transfers by the people to whom we've delegated a task. So that concludes our scintillating discussion of delegation, which is really, again, an exercise of our discretionary authority. So now we're looking at trusts which have a power to delegate. Again, back to Mr. Orwell in 1984, language controls thought, and this is the way I would like for you to think about the power of delegation. Trusts aren't directed. A trust contains a power to direct, and it normally is finite. It's defined, it's limited, and it needs to be defined and limited. And if it's not, you may want to think twice about accepting that trust. Think about, I'm trying to control your behavior here by use of language, very Orwellian. A trust has a power of direction within it. So, 4 key elements of a directed trust. 1, it starts with the grantor. It's a power the grantor puts in the trust document, and it directs some third party to perform a function. They have the power to do that. So the first step, grantor clearly directs. Second step, in the terms of the governing document, in a trust, as you all know, that's the governing document, and a side agreement, a handshake deal isn't good enough. Has to be in the governing document. Also, we need to be operating in a state where the state statutes are friendly to the idea of direction, which is increasingly becoming the norm, but nonetheless, we need to be aware of what our state statutes say about the exercise of a power of discretion. Power of direction. And from a practical standpoint for the trustee, we need to be comfortable that the governing document and the state statutes relieve us as the trustee of responsibility for the activities and results of the advisors or the agent's activity. So those are our fundamental features. We know that so documents need to be drawn up in line with the state statutes, combining the 2 and 3 of the preceding 4 bullets. For those of you, some of you are in the directed trust business, accepting trusts with powers of direction, and so you may have evolved to the point where your trust administrators, trust staff are able to deal with trusts and the power of direction without involving legal counsel. But if you're new to the idea of direction, strong recommendation to have legal counsel involved. Until you reach a comfort level that you understand how direction works and how it plays out in the jurisdictions you operate in, because there, as we're going to see in just a moment, there are multiple different approaches to the trustee's liability and responsibilities under a power of direction. You need to have that in line. A real practical observation here, kind of down in the trenches, we've run into in our consulting work some trust departments or trust companies who are assessing an acceptance fee for trusts that contain a power of direction. Not a lot, but it makes a lot of business sense. What it does for your new business development efforts is a parallel question. But remember, you're going to, in reviewing these trusts, some of which you're not going to want if the power of direction isn't clearly defined, you're going to incur a cost in terms of resources spent, energy expended to conduct that review, and then you decide that the trust is poorly drafted, so you won't accept it. You got nothing. So a thoughtoid for your consideration. The power of direction is defined in multiple different ways, state to state. And we're going to talk about each of the 4 items listed here with some brevity. Also remember, case law differs. In the case of trust with a power of direction, particularly under the Uniform Directed Trust Acts, there is little or no case law, and case law provides the texture, the context in which the somewhat sterile statute is applied. Very little time. The end result is that of the types of approaches to the power of direction, they all pretty much share the same thing, and that is they allow the power of direction to be in a document, and then they attempt to limit the trustee's liability under that power of direction. And most states have voted with their feet. In other words, Section 185 probably isn't the strongest in terms of protecting the trustee. So really only Iowa continues to have this their state statute based on this section. Indiana recently enacted the Uniform Directed Trust Act. When we go forward to the Uniform Trust Act, Section 808, really the same structure. You'll notice in the middle it says the trustee shall act in accordance with the exercise of the power of direction unless manifestly contrary, blah, 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 blah. So there's still some liability, responsibility for monitoring and essentially taking away the power of direction that rests with the trustee. We see the states listed at the bottom of the slide that where their statute is based on Section 808. Also notice there at the bottom, there are 2, 4, 6, 7 states that were in this category, but have recently adopted the Uniform Directed Trust Act. There are a number of states, and this is there's no section to cite here because these are states that have not taken either the preceding 2 approaches, but have really carved out their own approach in a more aggressive fashion. In other words, more aggressively supporting the idea that the trustee can rely on the party who is subject to the power of direction. In other words, if the power of direction authorizes the investment an RIA to manage the assets, these states are more aggressive in providing liability protection to the trustee. And you see the list of states that are in this category, and then the 6 states that have moved away from their more unique approach and have embraced the Uniform Directed Trust Act, at least as the basis for their statute. It will be interesting to see how the states that have taken this more aggressive approach, how they react to the Uniform Directed Trust Act. States like South Dakota, New Hampshire, Delaware, Kentucky, Nevada have been very trustee friendly. And one of the ways they've been trustee friendly is by giving the trustee a fair amount of protection in the case of a power of direction in a trust. So that will be interesting to watch if those more aggressive states go the way of the uniform directed trust, or want to continue to be more aggressive in protecting the trustee. Again, no right or wrong answer there, really just what will their approach be. So finally, we get to the Uniform Directed Trust Act. There are 13 states listed here who have, as of Friday, enacted the Uniform Directed Trust Act. Remember, just like with the other sections we've talked about, there may be some tweaks in these states, so you always want to go back to your state version. There may be some adjustments or modifications that are included. Uniform law commissioners allow that. Rhode Island will be, if they adopt it, it's currently under consideration, they would be the 14th state. For those of you who are superstitious, you're certainly looking forward to that, so we can get beyond the lucky number 13. So, what do we need to think about now, back into our practical real world conversation? And because we as a trustee are not exercising our power of delegation under our discretionary authority, the governing document is telling us we're going to be directed in certain aspects. It really goes, the fundamental question of protecting your organization and its liability in this context goes to the pre-acceptance review. 12 CFR, was it 0.6A? Anyhow, Reg 9, pre-acceptance. That's your opportunity to protect your organization in the case of a directed trust. Once you accept the trust, you better like the power of direction and the way it's handled. Remember that these statutes tend to be relatively new in many states, which, as we said about earlier, leads to a dearth of case law or regulatory enforcement action, which we can benefit from. Also, the statutes vary considerably from state to state in terms of the liability, and that's what we saw in the 4 examples we looked at. The main point here is the time to focus on the power of direction and trust is at pre-acceptance. If you don't like it, don't accept it. Strategic decision, not a historically, many trust departments within banks didn't deal with directed trust. They weren't comfortable with either their state statute, or maybe the state statute didn't exist, that addressed the liability when dealing with a directed trust. So many of you may still be in the category of this being a new idea. You haven't accepted directed trust in the past. View it as a new business line. Give it the same risk assessment and oversight before accepting your first trust that contains a power of direction that you would as you would going into any other new business line. It is different, and it's a strategic decision. The primary risks are, of course, even if you engage in a very robust business line review and your pre-acceptance is amazing in terms of weeding out trusts that are problematic, your primary risk is reputation. Is there something about the third party that may come back to haunt you? So reputation risk takes on a significant consideration here, where you may not it may not be as important a factor in other contexts. Operational and administrative. One of the problems where there's a power of direction is you didn't get to choose the third party. So you don't know if they have the ability to work with your custodian. Do their business practices and methods of communication coordinate with your trust accounting system? Unique to investment management, how are trades going to be handled? Operational administrative risk is very real here and needs to be addressed proactively. As a hint at the bottom of the page, one-offs are expensive. It's easy to say, well, it's a big trust, $10 million, we need the AUM for the revenue it'll generate, so we'll hold our noses and accept an inefficient process. Too frequently, it'll come back to haunt you. So now we're going to talk about a trust containing a trust protector. Spoiler alert, nothing new here. We've already talked about it all, because really a trust protector is just the name used to apply to the individual or the entity that has the power to direct. Interestingly enough, 41 states already have some form of trust protector. When I was dusting off my notes on this topic, I hadn't realized that that number was that large. And the reason I think that many of us are in that camp is because we don't hear about trust protectors. At least prior to about 10 years ago, we really didn't hear much about trust protectors unless you were in a particular pocket of activity. The idea of a trust protector, using the term trust director, exact same thing, just different words, is fundamental to the Uniform Directed Trust Act, because somebody has to have the power of direction, a trust director. And again, common law is lacking in this area. So whether that's good or bad is another question, but I think what it means is that our ability to anticipate how some of the close calls will be interpreted is limited. This is really self-explanatory, but a trust director is just that, the person, and a person in the Uniform Directed Trust Act, just like in most legislative acts, can mean an individual or an entity. It doesn't have to be a person, a living, breathing person. It can be an entity. But the trust director is the person or entity granted the power. As long as they're not serving as the trustee, that's really the only qualification. The trust director under the Uniform Directed Trust Act cannot be the trustee. Two entirely different roles. This section goes into the duties and liabilities of a directed trustee. This is where most of you really want to find comfort. You want to make sure that as this is embraced in your state, that there's significant protection provided to the trustee who accepts a trust that has this power of direction. And I'll let this text speak for itself. And again, this really repeats what we've already talked about. One of the clarifications here is that the trust protector has a task or a couple of tasks, but is not responsible for the day-to-day responsibility of the management of the trust, the administration of the trust. They may have the ability to authorize disbursements, but the rest of the administration of the trust rests with the trustee. Excuse me. And again, saying the same thing, a trust protector can have as few or as many powers as the grantor deems appropriate. One of the reasons that I originally came to this topic with years ago with a negative impression of trust protectors is that one of the common powers is to remove or replace the trustee. As someone who was the trustee at the time, that struck me as problematic. If that power is abused. If it's not abused, I don't have a problem. but there's a lot of room for abuse there. So again, be careful in accepting these things. Are you comfortable with the individual or entity who has the power to remove you? The thrilling conclusion, finally and at long last. Hopefully, at least some of you are still awake. I want to thank you for riding along. Conclusion. We're only talking about two things: the trustee's power of discretion and trusts where someone other than the trustee is given a power of direction. Those are the only two things we're talking about here. In the discretionary category, we have delegation. In the directed trust category, we have trust protectors, which is just the name that applies to the person who has the power of direction. It's really very straightforward. In the first category, discretion, you're always responsible no matter who's doing the work. You've delegated a function, not the work. In the latter, in a trust with the power of direction, if the governing document is written effectively and your state statute is supportive, you may in fact be able to reduce your liability in accepting that trust. So thank you, everyone. And at this point, we will open it up for any questions that may have come up.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Appreciate the time. Very informative presentation. There were a couple of questions that came through. A couple that had asked for direct follow-ups offline. We'll be happy to do that. One of the questions that came through just really was as it related to the slide deck itself and making it available after the fact. So just to reiterate that this slide deck, the presentation, and a recording of the webinar will be available at the ITM 21st website. Look for the education tab and the recent webinars page starting tomorrow. So one of the questions, and then we can wrap up with this just in the interest of time. Kevin, we found RIAs want to custody the assets when they are delegated the investment responsibility. The regulators have not been in favor of this. Have you known a trust, bank, or company regulated by the OCC to delegate the investment responsibilities and not custody the assets?
Yes, I have. In fact, when I'll use one that's near and dear to home, and that is when I was the head of ING Trust, we would delegate investment management to affiliated investment advisors or registered investment advisors and their investment advisor representatives. And we would custody those assets at Pershing, which was the custodian of their choice. Now, if you do that, there's nothing wrong with that, but the catch is back to that administrative and technological efficiency. You need to be able to gather the information from that custodian on the same or similar basis as you do from the custodian you prefer. If you can't gather the information effectively and efficiently, then you have a real challenge. And so, yes, it happens where trustees will allow multiple custodians, in other words, custodians of the RIA's choosing, but it's only a good idea where you're able to get the data from the custodian into your trust accounting system.
Great. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thanks to everyone who was in attendance today. We appreciate your participation. Well, we will take about a month off. We'll reconvene on July 22nd. And thanks to Kevin for taking the time to deliver a very informative presentation. Thanks all. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.